that should be the center of modern economics. We're having the 1%, and what does the 1% try to do? It's taken over all of the universities in the United States. You're taught how to let the free market, let the rich people do whatever they want to the poor people. And the Romans were very clear about their idea of freedom. To the oligarchy in Rome, freedom was their right to do anything they wanted to their inferiors, to the rest of the population. That's what a free market is. It's a freedom for the creditors and the landowners to charge rent and the monopolies to take as much as they want from their victims.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 220. And this episode is with Michael Hudson, who is Distinguished Research Professor of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and President of the Institute for the Study for Long-Term Economic Trends. Michael researches finance, the history of economics, and the role of debt in shaping society. This is actually Michael's third appearance on the show, and in this episode we talk about the history of periodic debt cancellations in the ancient world, and that includes Babylon, Rome, and Greece, and how these policies helped to stave off economic collapse, how the failure to implement them contributed to the demise of these civilizations, and then how they might be used in today's economies. Michael's most recent book is Temples of Enterprise, and there's a link to it in the description. And I also need to mention that this episode was recorded at Austin's Ale House in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York, and I'm extraordinarily thankful to them for letting us use their space. And they also served us some very tasty margaritas, as Michael remarks numerous times. But Austin's Ale House is in a lovely location. It's got some great outdoor seating arrangements, which we took advantage of. And it's also extremely popular in the area. So if you're around, it comes highly recommended. And there's a link to Austin's Ale House as well in the description. Otherwise, I remain painfully close to a 5-star average on Apple Podcasts. So if you're listening there, please take just a moment or a few seconds to tap in a rating. Also, there's a link to the Patreon in the description in case you'd like an ad-free feed and show notes. Currently, even non-members can ask questions for the monthly AMAs, and I am absolutely hungering for your questions. So please head over there and ask some for September. Now, without any further ado, I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Michael. So, Michael, you've been studying the history of debt and the collapse of civilizations for many decades now. I mean, at least, we were just speaking before this, going back to your time at the Peabody Museum, and I'm wondering if you were initially interested in this topic because just because of its historical interest, or more because of its implications for the present.
I went into economics because I was interested in debt. I had a long discussion with my mentor, Terence McCarthy, and I was at the time working for a bank on Wall Street and later worked for Chase Manhattan Bank, and it was obvious that the debts were growing faster than the economy could be paid. And I came to New York around 1961 and began to work on Wall Street. In 1965, for Chase Manhattan, my job was to analyze how much money Latin American banks could afford to borrow. And to do that, I had to say, well, how much can they pay in interest? What's their carrying ability? And I saw even then they didn't have any more. There was no way that they could afford to take any more. And needless to say, that did not make the officers in the international department very happy, because they wanted to increase their loans just as the real estate department and oil departments wanted to increase their loans. So we had at one point a meeting at the Federal Reserve who questioned the forecast that I did. I was looking mainly at Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. And the Federal Reserve man said, Dr. Hudson, according to your calculations, Britain can't afford to borrow any money. It's broke too. And I said, well, actually, that's right. It has to keep borrowing just to maintain the exchange rate of the British pound. The Federal Reserve said, but they've maintained it, haven't they? And I said, if that's what they've done. He said, that's because we lend them the money. And I said, yes, that's exactly what's keeping them afloat. And they said, well, it's the same thing toward Latin America. We're supporting these countries. That's part of the Organization of American States. We're telling the bankers here, you can lend them the money because we're protecting them and we're keeping them solvent. And we are having the World Bank showing them how to carry their debt service by privatizing their property, the IMF giving them advice. And so under these terms, don't you think they can continue to pay Chase Manhattan for new loans? And I said, well, for the immediate future, yes. And I said, fine, that's what they wanted. Well, I could see that the only way that they could keep expanding debt in Latin America and England was by borrowing the money. That's called a Ponzi scheme, where you keep solvent by borrowing the money to pay the interest and the debt service. And after I left Chase, I developed a balance of payments accounting format at Chase to analyze the oil industry's balance of payments. And I wanted to extend this analysis to the whole U.S. balance of payments as a means of analyzing the actual financial flows of a country's exports and investments and military spending and tourist transfers. And that took me about a year. I found out that the entire U.S. balance of payments deficit was military spending abroad. The private sector was exactly in balance. So I began to see what is going to happen. How long can they continue this Ponzi scheme of lending countries the money to be able to pay their creditors? Well, by the late 1970s, matters were getting worse and worse. I'd become an economic advisor to Canada in the mid-1970s, and then I advisor to UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, where I wrote a series of papers on the fact that the Latin American, the Global South, could not have possibly afford, even with foreign support, to pay their debts. And I argued that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank was making it harder and harder to pay their debts by, first of all, raising the amount of debt they owed. Secondly, by privatizing their infrastructure, rising their cost of business. And most of all, their problem was the philosophy of competing internationally and paying their foreign debts by lowering the wage rates, which, of course, made labor less productive. And I'd written my doctoral dissertation at New York University on American protectionism and the philosophy of industrial capitalism that made America rich. And the philosophy here, as in England and as in Germany and France, was, well, you want two things in order to become competitive in an international economy. You want, number one, to raise living standards of labor, because well-fed, well-housed, well-educated labor is more productive and can undersell pauper labor. And secondly, you want the government to pick up all of the external costs of living, the cost of education, the cost of health care, medical care. If they are made a government expense, then employers don't have to pay labor enough wages to have to pay these costs themselves. And I saw that the philosophy that was developing in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, was the exact opposite of all this, and that there was no way that the Latin American countries could pay their debt. I said that at a big United Nations UNITAR meeting in Mexico City, convened by a man who wanted to become Mexico's president. And there was a riot after I said this. And I pulled my whole delegation out, and I pulled the Canadian delegation out with me. Karl Polanyi's daughter, Carrie Polanyi, was one of the people. And I thought this is something. The Russian delegate came out and said, you've taken over the whole conference. You've said the unspeakable. And that's when I realized that the idea that countries could not pay their debt was really important, and decided I'm going to write a history of debt. Beginning around 1980, 1981, I began to write this history, and it was easy going back to the 19th century. I drafted going back to the medieval times, to the Crusades, and the end of even a bit of Rome and Greece. But then it became apparent that there were references to the Jubilee year and to Near Eastern backgrounds of debt cancellations. Well, what I was advocating was, if the debts can't be paid, either you have to write them down, or if you don't write down Latin America's debts, then you're going to have the IMF, the World Bank, and the U.S. State Department insisting that they just sell off their raw materials, their land, their mineral rights, their public infrastructure to foreign investors, and use the proceeds to pay the foreign creditors, and then they'll be left without a patrimony, without these natural resources to earn. And this will be exactly what happened to the 14th and 15th and 16th century French and Spanish kings that went bankrupt again and again and again, and finally drove down the Fuggers and the other bankers with them. So I began to read about Mesopotamia. And it was very difficult. Most of the writing was in French and German. There was almost an antipathy in the English-speaking world to read this. And because I had studied linguistics at the University of Chicago for my BA in history, but I didn't read cuneiform. I did try to learn hieroglyphics, but I wasn't that interested in what was written in hieroglyphic. So I began to read the laws of Hammurabi, and even more important, the debt cancellations, the clean slates of Hammurabi and his all of the other members of his dynasty, and all of the neighbors of Babylonia and earlier in Sumer. And what I found, it didn't matter that I hadn't studied Assyriology, because the translation of each of their speeches was completely different in German, French, and in English and American. Each of them would, when it come to, well, what exactly did they do when they were proclaiming order? The American, Samuel Klamer, said, well, they had a tax reduction, and that's just what Ronald Reagan should do. He should cut taxes just like Rukagina did in Sumer. And he wrote a New York Times editorial for that. A tax cancellation. Well, a lot of tax debts were canceled because the major debt in the Bronze Age were to the palace sector and to the temple sector, to the large institutions. The British said these are a free trade law. And Wilfrid Lambert and I had a long discussion at one of the rencontres for Assyriological meetings on that. And he wanted to see whether I could, being an economist, could talk about Assyriology. And the one word he wanted to find was underarum, which was the word that Hammurabi used for a debt cancellation. It meant a free-flowing, meaning that debt servants who were held as bond servants to their creditors had the freedom to go back to their original houses and not be a servant anymore. And the slaves that were pledged to creditors could also be returned to their former masters. Well, okay, that was, but that wasn't really a free trade, although I think that obligations to pay a tariff to kings were probably part of the Assyrian debt cancellations. The Germans had just what I wanted to hear, debt cancellation. The German Assyriologist Krauss wrote in incredibly different German Professorendeutsch a whole study of this. And that was very sympathetic. But then the French, I thought, had the best translation at all. They called it's a restoration of order, ending the disorder. It was a return to the mother condition. the Sumerian word was amargi, from ma, meaning mothers. So, for instance, when the Iraqi president Hussein said, this is going to be the mother of all wars, he meant the paradigmatic wars. Well, the amargi was the paradigmatic balance of society the way that it should be. So I wrote a draft of what I'd found, and my neighbor and friend Alex Marshak, who had written about the Ice Age and the leading Ice Age archaeologist, sent what I'd written to the head of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, Karl Lambert Karlofsky. He immediately said, "Do you want to be a research fellow on the Harvard faculty and do this? This is revolutionary. Let's do it." So it took us a few years to. He said it became apparent that I couldn't simply write it. We had the idea: let's invite the leading Assyriologists, Egyptologists, people who were scholars who could read all of the Bronze Age proclamations, letters, legal cases, and we're going to study we're going to write a financial and economic history of the ancient Near East. So we began to do that in 1994, and over the next 20 years, we did a series of 6 colloquium and published 5 volumes rewriting the history. And I had tried to write what became my my popular volume, Unforgiven Their Debts, to a number of publishers, like the University of California. Every publisher or an agent I had would send it to said, "We can't publish this. It's impossible for society to have begun by canceling the debts because creditors wouldn't have made loans anymore." Well, of course they wouldn't, but the creditor, people didn't borrow money as a debt. They ran up to arrears. They couldn't pay the costs, the debts that were due at the end of harvest time for all the credit they'd run up during the year. For instance, right now, we're sitting in a bar, and Americans are certainly familiar enough with working class people running up a tab at the bar. They pay it on payday. The same thing happened in Mesopotamia. The alewomen were a public infrastructure utility, and you'd run up the money that you owed them at the end of the harvest. And if the harvest was bad and you couldn't pay, what were you going to do? The ruler, Hammurabi, and all the other rulers of the dynasty said, well, either the debtors are becoming the bondservants of the alewomen and the palace creditors and any temple officials who officiated a wedding or a funeral who they owed money to. Do we really want our citizenry on the land to all of a sudden have to work for their debtors? If they do that, they will owe their labor to the debtors. They can't serve in the army anymore. They can't work on the infrastructure, on the the public infrastructure that we do in the non-planting, non-harvesting time to build the city walls, the palaces, the temples, and all of the other construction. So instead of doing to their labor force what the International Monetary Fund does to Latin America and having them lose all their property and becoming international debt peons, they canceled the debts. Well, that was basically what they found, and we realized that there was no point in trying to go to the public at large and write all this without getting full backing from the whole Assyriological and Egyptology community. Let's have the scholarships all over the world: German, French, Russians, Italians, Americans, even English. We had everybody there, and we rewrote the history of the ancient Near East, the privatization of the ancient Near East, the land use and land tenure, the debt and economic renewal, the origin of accounting in the ancient Near East, labor and public enterprise. So that took us from about 1994 to about maybe 2008 to publish the very ending of all of this. Well, needless to say, there's hardly any of this has got into the public domain, apart from the Assyriological group and apart from my writings, because publishers still would not publish anything that we wrote as a trade book, because they said the creditors couldn't pay it. So I began to write a series of academic articles. I was basically encyclopedias were coming to me to write articles in them. I was invited by all the major Assyriological and archaeological magazines to write articles, and I realized that at the root of everything was, how did money and credit begin? And I've just published all of these articles in my Temples of Enterprises. I realized that, well, the books that I wrote through Temples of Enterprise and the Collapse of Antiquity were an attempt to popularize them. The technical articles showed, okay, we have to look at how did money begin, how did land tenure begin. And I realized that the way to explain how different the Bronze Age was, how different civilization was at its takeoff, was to say what didn't happen. Because if you just begin by saying what did happen, everybody will say, no, it couldn't have happened that way. That's not how we do things. That's not what Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher would have done if they could have got into a time machine and gone back to Hammurabi and said, no, that's not what to do. Don't interfere with the market. They can't pay the debts, let them pay the price, let them go into bondage. If that would have happened, civilization never would have taken off. So I realized that everything had been taught in college about the very university study, PhD, for the courses about here's what money is, here's how money began, was all propaganda that was made up in the late 19th century when by opponents of government, by essentially the predecessors of Milton Friedman, the Austrian school, and which they were represented the landlord class, the monopoly class, and the financial class. And they said the government, something terrible is happening. In America, they're passing antitrust legislation, what Teddy Roosevelt's doing. In Germany, they're nationalizing, what should be private enterprise. They're preventing us from making money by charging whatever the market will bear. The best kind of an economy is one with no government at all. Well, how could they define it? They have to say, well, civilization began without a government. And to people, I think Ronald Reagan, when he said the worst words in the English language is, the government's here to help you. What he meant was, from the very beginning of civilization, in this libertarian view, you had private entrepreneurs trying to make money, trying to create wealth, and the government interfered them by not letting them charge enough rent, by not letting them collect on their debts, by reducing the population to bondage, by keeping basic infrastructure and basic human needs in the public domain instead of letting them be monopolized for economic rent. And so the theory of money that I was taught in universities, and that every economist is brainwashed into thinking, except for the modern monetary theorists at the University of Missouri at Kansas City back then, said, well, money began in barter. And everybody would you'd have people growing wheat, corn, they'd maybe be weaving clothes and wool, or they'd be giving you wool. They'd be making handicrafts, shoes, and some people would provide raw materials like silver was something they liked, and they liked silver because it was lasted a long time. It was uniform, and that was what they wanted in barter. And so, because the people who were able to save money wanted something like silver or gold, that's why silver and gold was money. Well, the reason the banks wanted silver and gold was that's something that the financial sector owned. And the last thing that these free enterprise monetary people wanted was the idea that governments could create money. Well, and I began to look at how did money come into being. Well, it's obvious that it couldn't have happened the way that the economists are taught. One thing they say, silver is in uniform quality. Well, it wasn't uniform quality. If you're giving silver, how do you know it's pure silver? I think it was like 7/8 pure in Babylonian and various purities that were standardized in Rome and in Greece. So it wasn't uniform. There was counterfeiting way back then. So one thing, it's not as uniform as you thought. It didn't rust. That's true, that it lasted. And but then how do you express this money in prices? You can't go with a piece of silver and say, I'll pay you a piece of silver for a bushel of grain to go home and make bread with. How do you get an equivalency? Well, you'd have to have some either a measure of weight for the silver, or you'd have to have a volume measure of a cup. Well, if you have a scale in antiquity, how are you going to measure out a teeny little piece of silver for that bushel of grain? There were not scales of that quality in antiquity. It's just silly.
Yeah.
That kind of thing never could have happened. And what were the denominations of that people used? A mina was divided into 60 shekels. 60 shekels had a weight. That was silver weight was made equivalent to grain volume. And most of the debts of the population, being an agrarian economy, paid in grain. Well, the economists said, we don't understand that. How can you carry around grain in your pocket? You go to the alehouse, you pay for your beer in grain. Doesn't it get sort of seedy in your pocket after a while? Well, there was never any attempt to understand how transactions occurred in the Bronze Age. And it was not only the Bronze Age, it was down to medieval England, much of medieval Europe. Most debts were paid once a year when the crop was in. They weren't paid during the year. You would run up a debt during the year. As I said, you'd run up a debt to, here we are at Austin's Ale House, to be settled at harvest time on the threshing floor. We have all of the contracts. They all said this money will be paid on the threshing floor. We'll weigh it out. The money that's paid to the ale house will go to them. The money that's paid to the palace for advances of what you need to live and to cultivate your land will go to the palace. What you owe to the temples for what they provide will go to that. What you owe to creditors, if you got sick and you needed money, they'll go to them. All the debts are going to be paid then. And then it seemed to be that, you say that and you think, oh, now I understand how it works. But there's that nobody had to lend money for any of this. Everybody was just doing business. They'd give you the drinks. They'd give you all the services you needed. It was a credit economy. There's one thing that is not taught in American economic universities: credit and debt. It didn't play any role at all in this idea of money. Most money were to pay the debts that you ran up during the year. It was used once a year or so I'm talking about for goods and services, not for financial transactions by traders using silver among themselves. So the problem is, it's very nice to, you harvest the grain, you bring it into the threshing floor, But what happens when the harvest fails? That's something that a kind of question that economists stutter about. It's something that if you mention that to someone like Paul Krugman, he's going to just, what do you mean they can't pay? They get confused. Well, if you can't pay, we're back at the problem that I mentioned at the beginning. Think of what happened when England went into India after England conquered, the British East India Company, I should say, conquered England. Much of India was run before under certainly the Islamic North, and there was credit way down through Islam, and the rulers realized that if the crops failed, you couldn't reduce the population to bondage, because then there wouldn't be anyone to do the work anymore, right? Or they'd all leave. Certainly they couldn't be in the army anymore because they'd be bond servants. Well, that was exactly the problem that the Babylonians felt and the Sumerians felt. You wanted a population to be free on the land. Freedom meant being able to produce your own means of support. And so the Sumerian rulers, the Babylonian rulers, and all of the neighboring countries had similar debt cancellations that say, well, either there was a drought, and if there's a drought, then debts don't have to be paid. That's in Hammurabi's laws, as well as his debt cancellation proclamations. If the storm god Adad floods the land, don't have to pay. And whenever there was a military conflict that sort of devastated the land or called the cultivators away, the debts wouldn't be paid because you didn't want the population to be in bondage. And the flip side of that is you didn't want the result of bondage to be a creditor class emerging with its own economic power. Because if you had a creditor class emerging, as they did in the late Roman Empire, in the Byzantine Empire, in the 9th and the 10th centuries of our era, the leading creditors would use their credit to appropriate the land of debtors who couldn't afford to pay the taxes. Well, pledge your land as collateral, we'll take it from you, just like America will take Latin American land to pay the debt. And they would get their own army. Well, okay, now you're a bond servant, you're part of our army. But it's as if they were telepaths and read Milton Friedman in the 19th century. And Margaret Thatcher said, well, let's just get rid of the government that is trying to prevent us from reducing the population to bondage. Let's attack Byzantium and Constantinople. And there were continual wars of the large creditor class and the landowning nobility against Constantinople. And at one point in the 10th century, Constantinople won. They wanted peace. They said, look, we have the strongest army here in Constantinople. We're stronger than your creditors. Just accept the fact, they were going to have a balanced economy, and we want the people to be free because we're threatened by all sorts of invaders coming from the east, and we have to defend ourselves, not to mention the Christians from the west, trying to loot us. And so there was a great, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire invited the rival general to have a dinner to make peace. And he sat down with the general and said, how can we prevent this kind of fighting that happened again? We're peaceful to you. We're not going to do anything to you. You can go back to your own land and have as much of the wealth as you possess, but you can't take the wealth away from the population. And the general said, well, he said exactly what a classical Greek tyrant said to another tyrant when Thrasybulus was asked, what do we do to prevent an oligarchy from taking over? Thrasybulus went to a wheat field, and he said, look here, wheat, they're all different sizes. He took a scythe, and he cut off the stalk so everything was at the same level. And he didn't have to put that into words. It was a visual metaphor. But the Byzantine general said, you have to prevent this egotism of the wealth from trying to take over. You have to tax them away. You have to prevent a wealthy oligarchy from developing, because if they do, they're going to want to keep attacking you and getting rid of the state, because that's what rich people do. Now, I thought that should be the center of modern economics. We're having the 1%, and what does the 1% try to do? It's taken over all of the universities in the United States. You don't learn about how to make a mixed economy, public-private economy with balance. You're taught how to let the free market let the rich people do whatever they want to the poor people. And the Romans were very clear about their idea of freedom. To the oligarchy in Rome, freedom was their right to do anything they wanted to their inferiors, to the rest of the population. That's what a free market is. It's a freedom for the creditors and the landowners to charge rent, and the monopolies to take as much as they want from their victims. And that is not exactly what Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and the classical political economists meant by a free market. They meant a market free from monopoly rent, free from landlords, and especially free from private banking. And that fight has been going on ever since antiquity. So in the articles that I've done on the origins of money, the origins of credit, the origins of interest, you see a common theme from the Bronze Age inception of economic practices, economic enterprise in the Middle East, down through classical antiquity, through medieval Europe to today. The same kind of fight by wealthy classes wanting to be an oligarchy, a financial oligarchy, and taking over the government. That should be not only the theme of economics, do you want to support that or do you want to oppose it, but the theme of the history of civilization, as far as I'm concerned. That's what today's civilizational fight is between the NATO West, the golden billion, and the global majority in the BRICS, trying to create an alternative to the International Monetary Fund, to the World Bank, and to the whole neoliberal idea of getting rid of a government and letting private banks in the privatized financial sector control the most important public utility, which is money and credit. That's why China has financed its remarkable economic growth without government debt. It prints its own money. That's why Stephanie Kelton has argued that America doesn't have to borrow from the creditors to increase public spending. It can simply do what Abraham Lincoln did in the Civil War. You can print the money. Every government that has fought a war has had to print its own money. It didn't borrow the money because there was no money to borrow or no lenders who were willing to lend. They print their own money. But on the return to peace, you have the creditors fight back, and the last thing they want is to fund a war. Well, in the United States in 1913, this whole fight came to a head. Before 1913, the U.S. Treasury had done everything that the Federal Reserve had done ever since. It had 12 local districts that it would essentially handle the money supply of credit to the markets, to move the crops, to supply credit. You had J.P. Morgan and the bankers say, let's prevent money from being a public utility. Let's get the government out of money. Let's make money purely in the hands of a privatized financial class. To do that, we can't get rid of the Treasury. There'll always be a Treasury, but we can take all of its powers and have a privatized Federal Reserve. And they controlled the Federal Reserve. They said, we're not even going to let the Treasury or a Washington official be a member of the Federal Reserve. In fact, we're not going to have its center in Washington. We're going to move the Federal Reserve to New York City, and with branches in Boston, where the financial center. in Chicago for the grain trade. In Philadelphia, that was a center. We're going to completely take control of the money supply so that it's the bankers who will decide where to supply credit for the economy. Well, we know today what bankers supply credit for. They don't finance industry. They have not industrialized the United States. They've deindustrialized it. Bankers make loans when there's collateral against it to buy other collateral that is pledged to the bankers in exchange for the debt. 80% of loans are for real estate. Loans are made against stock holdings, bond holdings. You can buy a company with stock and pledge, the company itself as collateral for what you borrow to take it over, which is what private capital does primarily. This doesn't happen in a country like China. They make loans for tangible capital investment. And that's the difference. What we have today is not industrial capitalism anymore. It's finance capitalism. And that dynamic, you can just trace how it's evolved from the ancient Middle East through Greece and Rome, through the Crusades, to the origins of states in basically the 17th and 18th century. You had what you know as a modern state today is essentially a creation of the financial sector. From the beginning of the Crusades through about the 16th century, the Catholic Church was a global, an international power over all of Christendom. The Catholic Church treated secular kings as their subordinates, and they said, how do we gain control of Christendom? We don't have an army, as Stalin noted, but they didn't need Stalin to tell them they didn't have an army. They went to Norman warlords like Robert Guiscard in southern Italy and Sicily, and William the Conqueror in 1066 in England. Said, we will bless you for taking over the country if you will pledge fealty to the papacy, and southern Italy, Sicily, England will be fiefdoms of the Catholic Church. In Rome, you'll be fiefs of the popes. We'll expect you to let us appoint the bishops in your countries, and the church lands were larger than the royal estates in England and many other realms, and we'll expect you to pay tribute to us. But we will back you and give you church approval of your divine right not to let Parliament and other people limit your ability to fight wars on our behalf. And Rome, by the 12th century, Rome tried to subdue other European countries to its own control. And Germany, the German kings, who were officially the Holy Roman emperors, were not warlords. They didn't want Roman control. They wanted to appoint their own bishops and to have the church part of a public society instead of having a theocratic control. So the popes told Edward Henry III, won't you tax your country to finance our war to fight against the German control of southern Italy? And you had Parliament that had already passed the Magna Carta in 1215, give Parliament the right to not let kings impose taxes without their consent. Well, when King John was the subject of the Magna Carta, he asked Pope Innocent III, won't you excommunicate these parliamentarians trying to create, they didn't use the word economic democracy, but try to question my divine rule. Innocent excommunicated the critics of the Magna Carta, said it was an absolute disaster. Not exactly what you're taught in the textbooks today. And 50 years later, when John's son, Henry III, tried to raise money to go fight the Pope's war against the Germans, there was a civil war in England, and the Pope, Parliament passed the provisions of Oxford and Westminster to limit it. The new Pope, Alexander, excommunicated them. There was a civil war, and the Vatican won and prevented Parliament from developing. Well, by the time the Crusades ended in about 1291, the popes began to lose the power, and you had, but the popes had brought into being a financial class. Because what they told Henry III is, we know you don't have the money. It costs money, of course. Here are some signed documents. Here are papal bulls. We want you to sign these to the Italian bankers that we've rounded up that will provide the money to pay the troops. Because if you're going to have a war, you need funding. And so the Vatican said, how are we going to fund these wars and provide the financing for our Christians to fight against to essentially fight against existing Christianity? Rome wanted to essentially conquer all. There were 5 patriarchates of Christendom. Rome was the least important patriarch. The main one was Constantinople. There was Antioch. There was Alexandria, and there was Jerusalem. That made 5. Rome said, these are all terrible. We're going to excommunicate them. We want to take over them. And indeed, the Crusades were fought against other Christians to impose Roman Christianity against Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Well, the Roman Pope said, well, and I guess if we're going to go to war to have our power, we have to reverse all of the teaching of Christianity. We have to change the opposition to usury, because, of course, these bankers that we're supporting want to get paid interest. And so you had the schoolmen, the academics, come up and say, well, there's a difference between interest and usury. Usury is what the Jews charge, but when the Christians do it, it's not usury, it's interest. It's like President Nixon saying, when the president does it, it's not a crime. So all of a sudden, that legitimized the growth of the banking family. Over the next few centuries, the 12th, 13th, and 14th century, the banking class got richer and richer, making loans to kings going to war. But around the 15th century and 16th century, there was a problem. The kings began, and European kings had the same problem that Latin America had in the 1980s and has again today. They couldn't pay the debts because the debts were growing at compound interest. You would have the bankers being told by whatever kings they lent to, especially French kings, I'm sorry, we can't afford to pay you. You'll have to lend us the money to pay. And the bankers would say, well, if we don't lend them the money, they'll default. And if they default, then how are we going to pay our depositors, who've got the money? We've got to lend them the money and hope that somehow it's going to work out. That's I called confidence, the confidence fairy. You have to give them the confidence. And so they would do it. But finally, the problem is that what did kings have to pay? They had the royal domain, the king's own property. That wasn't the property of the land, just their own private holding, like the palace in England, and its the other property that the Queen of England has, but not all the rest of the property. And they had the right to tax as long as the nobility would go along with it, and the kings could impose excess taxes on trade. They get trade monopolies to pay, but that still wasn't enough money to pay the debts. And so the banker said, it really, lending money to kings, we're going to lose the money because they can't get paid. What are we going to do? Well, they found that there was another model, and that model was in small Italian self-governing cities that were communes, Florence, Genoa, and in a commune, the whole commune was run collectively. They'd vote for their leaders, and the leaders of the commune would pledge all the money of the commune. and all the wealth of its members to pay the debts that they needed, the war debts that they needed to take on in order to fight wars against the Catholics that were trying, the Romans who were trying to attack them to take them over. So gradually the financial class said, well, what we need, if only national states could do what these self-governing Italian and Dutch communes had done, and do this on a national level. And Holland created a commune on that basis. The Dutch were invited to England to make the same kind of parliamentary states that had the power through Parliament to do what kings couldn't do, to say, we promise to pledge the whole national wealth to pay you creditors for the debts. And so they became what was called a fiscal state. The royal domains were not fiscal states. They were royal autocracies. But the fiscal state was able to pledge, have the right to levy taxes as a state right, not just as the right of the king for his own property. They could levy taxes, they could wage war for themselves. The king didn't have that anymore. And the modern state was created as a means of saying, here is a state that creditors will be willing to lend us the money so that we can wage war to defend ourselves against the Roman barbarians that are trying to destroy our society. And that was how the northern Protestant states of Europe fought against the Catholic states of Europe, and ultimately were able to develop banking at the national level. So it was really the financial sector politicized its economic power, not to get rid of the state, as they tried to under the libertarians today, but to create the state under the pro-creditor rules that we have in today's state. So that was how all of a sudden this whole the whole spirit of antiquity sort of got a revival. In antiquity, you had kingship. They called it royal divine kingship, where the king was able to proclaim, cancel the debts, and wage war, and to essentially have the power to prevent an oligarchy from developing. The new national states of Holland, England, and the subsequent northern European states, and all states today, now do have this power, but it's not to prevent an oligarchy from developing. It's to support the oligarchy in doing whatever it wants. It's a strong state. So when people like Ronald Reagan and the libertarians today say we're against the state, we want a state strong enough to crush you, and we don't want the state to be able to promote the public welfare at all. We want the state to be strong enough to pay the creditors, whether you're Argentina or Chile or any other state, a state strong enough to put the interest of international creditors above that of the domestic economy and the domestic economic growth. So you still have the same fight between, will the economy grow and be free, or will creditors have the right to reduce it to debt serfdom? So all of the academic articles that I've done on land tenure and the origins of enterprise, coinage, credit, and charging of interest, all were trying to trace this common denominator of civilization. And when you look at civilization as the political expression of creditor-debtor relationships, then you all of a sudden, this is as important for civilization as sex was for Freud. This is what it boils down to.
That was amazing. I'm always extremely impressed when I'm talking to someone and they can extemporaneously lecture on a topic like this, but when you've been studying one like this for 30 or 40 years and you're the authority on it, I guess it comes pretty easily to you. I mean,
it's nice to have a margarita.
It helps to have a margarita. I have all sorts of questions. There are tons of things on the table, so to speak. One thing that's sort of orthogonal to our purposes, but that jumped out at me that you said earlier, was all of these translations of these texts were quite different. And I recently spoke with Joyce Carol Oates, a novelist, poet at Princeton, and I remarked to her just how some of my favorite poems and poets don't write in English. And I can read a poem from one author in one translation and it's completely different. I hate it. In another, it's one of my favorites. And I just imagine that, translation is such an art and so important for the work you're doing. But this gets us back to these ancient texts, because I think one of the interesting lessons that might come out of what we're talking about today is, well, what we can learn from the collapse of these Bronze Age civilizations and the other civilizations of antiquity today. And you mentioned early in the conversation Hammurabi and Babylonia and the Jubilee years. And for our listeners who don't know who Hammurabi is or what a Jubilee is, what are they and how did they contribute to, well, the flourishing and then the downfall of these ancient civilizations?
It's funny. I'll have a roundabout way of answering your question. I began the day talking about translations. One of the most important books on the origins of money was written in 1888 by a German anthropologist, Heinrich Schurz. And he quoted the book, The Origins of Money, and he was looking at indigenous communities in the French possessions in the South Pacific and in Africa. And he saw, how did money really develop there? Well, it wasn't really money. What was property? And he found that what called primitive money, which wasn't the money of Mesopotamia, but were really valued objects that were always imported. And he said the way to get status in all of these communities was by foreign trade. And you would get foreign exotic materials, not silver and gold. It could be jewels, it could be shells, it could be anything that was sort of exotic, or you'd have trophies of one sort, like some item of dress or furniture that was owned by a wealthy chieftain's family would be valued. And so this was these items of prestige would become the money. Well, in a way, something like that happened in Mesopotamia when you had, alongside grain for money, you had silver. The gold didn't play much of a role. It was silver that was valued because Mesopotamia had to trade in order to get raw materials, copper, tin, that made the bronze into the Bronze Age, stone, hardwood. They had to get all of those and gems. That was the root of obtaining money. Money was always basically something foreign, and for most countries, silver and gold. In our era, is foreign. That's why India was called the sink of gold. The Indians wanted, in antiquity, down to the Middle Ages, all the gold was taken in India. In the 19th century, China and Japan wanted silver for everything. You had a drawing in for that. And you had this anthropologist, Schurz, describing all of this. Well, I'd written they asked me to write the introduction to the translation of this book. And so I got the translation about a week ago. And yesterday, I spent, they sent me the publisher's proofs, and they'd sent me the draft translation before, and I'd quoted all of what Schurz wrote about all of this. And I found when they sent it to me that they'd changed almost every paragraph of the translation. They'd changed the word. Instead of, they would use property instead of something else. They said, well, we can't say government because there wasn't a government in indigenous communities. They really wanted to get the anthropological translation right. So it took me 4 hours just to fix up the translations in my version and go into this. But what Schurz found was this influx of primitive money, meaning items of status that were highly valued and therefore used as prestige, were the root of polarization of these societies. And he said the role of money is to polarize these indigenous communities, and the role of the chieftain was something that was done by the Mesopotamian rulers. The role of the chieftain was to prevent the economy from polarizing, because if you end up letting it polarize, then you end up looking like Argentina, where you have 1% of the population holding all of the government debt and dollar debt in its own hands. They hold the dollar debt, but offshore in offshore banking centers, and you have the wealthy 1% impoverishing the rest of the society. Well, that happened in indigenous communities already that were having contact with the West in the 19th century. That's certainly what happened in classical antiquity, and it's certainly happening today. It's the foreign debt that was basically impoverishing a community because the money was foreign. The debt was in a foreign money that they had. And you had this, this constant of civilization. The tendency of economies to polarize always weakened the economy as a whole because it put the obligation to pay debt to creditors over and above the attempt by an economy to grow and expand by raising living standards and tangible capital formation. Clarifying that translation from today you'd say it was an awkward German of the 19th century. It's just something that I'm still doing even in modern, a century-old German today compared to Mesopotamia. Well, people know from the Bible where Babylonia was. The Persian Empire conquered Babylon, and most empires in antiquity were not like the American Empire, not like the Christian empires. They were willing to let the residents of a country follow whatever religion they wanted, live their own ways, have their own practices, as long as they paid tribute and taxes. All they cared about was the money. And so when the Persians through Babylonia conquered Israel, they took the wealthiest families back to Babylon as hostages, and they left the rest of the Judean land to be left with the people. The Jews over the next century or so assimilated with Babylonian. We have all of their letters, we have their wills, their marriage agreements, and they all had Babylonian scribes write. So we know that there was Babylonia, was part of the Babylonia and Sumer. Iraq and Syria were basically the root of the ancient Near Eastern takeoff. And right over the mountains, Iran, Persia, basically. So that is where all of the practices of enterprise developed. And they developed there because you had this rich agricultural land as you had along the Nile that was all for millennia deposited by rivers, by silt, rich silt from the rivers that made wonderful soil. But there was one problem with the soil. It didn't have metal because it was soil. It didn't have rocks, it had stone, it didn't, to build walls. Everything was made out of mud. You have mud bricks to make walls, palaces, the foundations, and all of that. So they had, in order to survive, Mesopotamia had to get the elements that made bronze, which is why they called it the Bronze Age. And they had to develop foreign trade and foreign enterprise. So all the practices of enterprise, money, weights and measures, you can't have exchange without weights and measures, charging of interest was essentially, everything would down on credit. If you would have a Sumerian or Babylonian palace or wealthy families consign textiles and rugs and weavings and clothes to merchants, entrepreneurs who would go north, or they'd go all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan to get raw materials. And in 2 years, in 5 years, they would have to repay the debt doubling time. So that worked out to 20% interest a year. It's simple interest, 1/5 a year, it doubles in 5 years. We have the textbooks that they taught scribes in, and they said, how long does it take a debt to double? 5 years. I wish that American universities teaching finance, when they say, what's the interest rate, what's the effect, how long does the interest rate take to double? So if you take out a mortgage and buy a house, pay 7% mortgage today, you take out a 30-year mortgage, how long, what did the bank get out of that? Well, in 10 years at 7%, the lender will get an interest as much as the seller of the house, the land, the property got, and they already get it back in 10 years. And in 20 years, it doubled again. And in 30 years, it's quadrupled. I mean, so you see how rapidly the increase in debt service is. Economies don't grow that fast. And the Babylonians knew that. So that while they taught the scribes to calculate how fast does a debt grow at 1 mina per month, 1 shekel per month, 60 shekels makes a mina. They also had plans, how fast does a herd of cattle grow? And a herd of cattle grows very much like modern economies grow. It grows in an S-curve and would taper off. And when the first Assyriologists began to translate these, they said, this can't be a mathematical exercise. It must be they're just reporting how a herd actually grew. But the Sumerians had quadratic equations. If you're a Sumerian scribe, you need to learn more mathematics than a high school student learns in America today. They did it forecasting astronomical relations, doing all sorts of calculations. They knew that you had the S-curve of herds growing. You knew the exponential growth of debt, and you see the difference was how much faster the debts grew. From that alone, they knew it's obvious that the debts can't be paid. If you don't cancel them, you're going to have a domestic oligarchy growing. Now, every introductory Economics 101 course should have that model. The mathematical models the Sumerians had were superior to any economic model that the National Bureau of Economic Research has today, or any economic central bank has, because they don't want to admit and acknowledge this simple mathematical reality of compound interest. They say debt doesn't matter because we owe it to ourselves. But who's the we and who's the ourselves? The we, the 99%, owe it to ourselves, the 1%. Yeah, that's the 1% talking. So when Paul Krugman says, just ignore debt, it doesn't matter because it's a wash. It's an asset on one side of the balance sheet, a liability, assets equal liabilities. That's simple accounting. Well, once you look at the distribution of wealth and you see the polarization of the wealth, who owes what to whom, and the growth of debt relative to income, relative to output, you see this is an unsustainable Ponzi scheme. And so this is what the Federal Reserve is facing without this being taught in any economic course. How do you how do you ever keep this Ponzi scheme going? Well, you keep if the banks will keep lending more money against real estate to borrowers, and the borrowers will use this money to bid against other borrowers to buy these expensive houses or commercial office building, then they will be able to pledge these high-priced office buildings, debt-ridden as they are, to the banks as more credit. You'll have the inflation of asset prices. Well, the most important prices in any economy are not consumer prices, not the consumer price index. Of course, that's important. The most important price, if you're looking at an economy's trajectory, are asset prices, real estate, stocks, and bonds. And that's what banks lend against. They don't lend money except for a few, for credit card debt, for automobile debt, for consumer debt. a small part of their loan. They don't lend money for goods and services. So the money that banks create, the credit money, is not used to inflate consumer prices. It's used to inflate housing prices, stock market prices, bond prices. You've had since the Obama bailout in 2009, you've had the largest bond market rally in human history, in empowering the financial class that owns the stocks and bonds and real estate, mainly in the top 10% of the population, but almost entirely the 1% of the population. You've had their asset prices creating wealth way at the top, whereas wealth for the bottom 50% has hardly changed at all. And for the bottom 20%, they've gone further and further into debt. That's what economics should be all about. To realize that we're dealing with two kinds of price trajectories: consumer prices for goods and services, and asset prices for the wealthy people. The wealthy people don't care about what they pay at the grocery store. They care about what the stock and bond prices are doing. And that's really what the problem is.
Toward this lesson that I'd like to get to for how the Jubilee years and this policy of debt forgiveness, you argue, might be useful in today's time, I think that we ought to contrast the Bronze Age experience or implementation of Jubilee years with what happened in Greece and Rome.
What made Western civilization different was they didn't have kings. You said that before there was a collapse of the Near East. It wasn't really a collapse. There was really bad weather around 1200 BC. There was a drought. It set whole populations in motion. They couldn't be where they were anymore. Same thing happened in India. The largest civilization of the Bronze Age, the Indus civilization, just literally dried up from a drought. That's what happened when the Indo-European speakers came in via Persia to the whole thing. And they were sort of walking on their knuckles, and they picked up the Indus civilization's practices, yoga, and all sorts of other things. So a collapse, you think of, they do something wrong, and they bring it to an end. And here's a lesson for today. What are we going to do wrong? Well, I guess the only parallel you could have is the Indus and Eurasia, Greece and Rome, didn't do anything wrong. You had the Greek-speaking Mycenaean society also come to an end. The population plunged because the crops failed. The palaces ended, and you had the local managers of the palace territories sort of end up as the administrators, and they just kept all of the land in their own, or whatever they could in their own names. You had it was called a dark age, dark in the sense that there's no writing in it. We don't know what happened. You had the syllabic alphabet of the Mycenaean Greek, the linear B, went out of practice. By around the 8th century, you had modern alphabetic writing came in, and you would have Bronze Age, you would have Near Eastern traders, mainly Phoenicians and Syrians, began to revival of trade. You had population began to recover around the 8th century BC, and they began to travel westward to Greece and across the Mediterranean all the way to Italy. And they would establish, usually merchants would do what they did in Mesopotamia. They'd establish a temple as sort of the businessmen's group there. And that would sort of be the public association, the Chamber of Commerce, as it were. And they would deal with, very often they would deal with offshore. For instance, in Italy, the big trade was offshore in Ischia. In the same thing in Greece, it would be offshore. Just like in from Mesopotamia. Much of its foreign trade would be conducted not in the core itself, but offshore in Bahrain or in the K areas outside of the big cities, outside the walls. Where in the cities you'd have the rule of law. Outside the walls, it was all free enterprise. But they brought this practice of charging interest, and they'd say, well, if we'll sell you on credit, but you have to pay interest. Well, the whole weights and measures were of the West weren't really very developed. You had every city and state having its own weights and measures, but they were all based on different mathematical bases. That of Mesopotamia was based on 60ths because it was developed in the temples that would distribute food to the dependent labor force, mainly war widows and orphans. You'd give them the administrative year was divided into 30-day months, and you'd give them a ration twice a day. That's 60. So you'd give them a month ration, here a bushel, and here's a cup a day. That's going to get you by the month. Next month you give another bushel. Well, that was 60th. Greece was different. Greece had been sort of in the orbit of Crete and Egypt. They used the decimal system of 10. So their rate would be 1% per month, for instance, or 10%, either one or the other. But Rome used divided the measuring system into on the basis of a year. And a year of 12 months, the Rome had 1/12. So Roman weights and measure 12 ounces or troy ounces in a pound. So to make it easier to account, you had the interest rates for each of the for Rome, Greece, and the Near East, all based on the local fractional accounting. Economists are not taught that. They said that's impossible. You have the free enterprise boys say, no, governments organize weights and measures. That's too public. You had high interest rates of 20% per year, decimalized in Mesopotamia because it was very risky in the Bronze Age. And then in Greece, it was more developed, so you lower the interest rates to 10%. And then in Rome, they established something that worked, a vicious oligarchy, destroying the population. That's what we call stability. Look at that low interest rate, 8.5%. They looked at all as progress without a clue that the answer has nothing to do with a economic basis for this counting. It was simply ease of mathematical accounting. When I first submitted that to, I think, the Journal of Economic Social History of the Orient, they all questioned that. It can't really be so simple, could it? And it took them 6 years to agree to publish that. And I think 2000, the year 2000, and finally they said, yes, that has to be it. That's the only explanation that fits. So all of these discoveries that I had as an outsider have now been accepted. And the reason I was able to get all of the assent from other classical and historians and historiologists was they'd refused, ever since the 1920s, cuneiform specialists had almost refused to talk to economists or non-historiologists because there was all sorts of social metaphor. Everybody wanted to project on the past their own dreams. The Vatican translated Sumerian documents and called it a temple state, needless to say. The Nazis translated it. You had all over the political spectrum. You had everybody having their own idea of what happened in the ancient Near East. And the Assyriologists feared, especially economists. They say, we have a lot of economists coming to us. Some crazy economists think that they were Keynesian back in the Bronze Age, and they were trying to say, let's spend money into the economy and create consumer demand. I think Warburton is the Egyptologist who does some of that stuff. And there's all of this nutty imagining, what would we do if we went back 4,000 years ago and could tell them how to do it. The Assyrians didn't want someone with their own preconceptions. But I really didn't know about what happened then, and I knew what was important that I wanted to follow. What was how was money and debt handled? And if I could figure out the monetary and the debt relations of a society, I could work from there to see the dynamics that you and I have been talking about for the last hour or so. For all that. And so they were willing to talk to me because I really wanted to say, can you tell me everything that you can find on debt? I can't read all of these documents. What do you have on debt and the interest rate and the contracts and enterprise and the land tenure documents and transfers? And what? How did they build the palaces and the city walls? Could you tell me what you have? And I was very receptive, and the fact that I was able to raise the money to pay their expenses, all to wherever we had meetings all the way from New York to St. Petersburg, Russia, to Germany. We had them all over, and they were willing to contribute to these volumes to realize, yes, we do want to now. We think we know enough that we didn't know in the 1920s, 100 years ago. We know enough now that we can try to at least tell anybody who's interested, here's how civilizations' economic relations begin. Well, of course, nobody wants to know that because they say, oh, no, this isn't what we, if it happened that way, then you need a strong government. Then you need control over oligarchies. That's not Milton Friedman's idea of a free market. A free enterprise, everything that is in the history of from the ancient Near East to classical antiquity, it goes against all of modern economic and political ideology and what people are taught. And that's why you don't have this, the origins of civilization, from, let's say, 2500 BC to about 1700 AD. It's all blocked out. We can't go there because it's so different that the load-up time, it took me, as I told you, I began to join the Harvard group in 1984. It was 1994. It took 10 years for me to familiarize myself, to talk to the Assyriologists, to read the literature. It's as if I had to get a whole separate PhD in ancient Near Eastern anthropology. To understand all of this. I'd never dreamed it, but I thought this is so important. This all of a sudden shows that what I can see is the modern problem of today's polarizing world economy. This goes way back to back then and how they handled it. Well, what they realized was if you don't cancel the debts, then you leave society falling into debt peonage, to bondage to the creditors. You have the creditors ending up ultimately not only with all the land and all the capital assets, but with the control over labor to essentially lead them not into debt bond servitude anymore, like you had in antiquity, but the same thing. You can live wherever you want, you can work for whoever you want for, but wherever you live, you're going to have to go into debt and use all of your income over and above basic subsistence to pay the creditors. Well, that's really what bondage is. That's what debt peonage is. So that's the common denominator that I'm trying to show that is a constant for the last 5,000 years. And if you look at civilization on the basis of this common denominator, you have the laws of motion that are happening. How does the way in which society resolve this question of what's going to come first, paying debts to creditors or writing down creditors' claims to save the economy's ability to grow and raise living standards and to make tangible capital investment? That's the dynamic of civilization. And that's the dynamic that's splitting the global majority today in the BRICS away from the Western garden. The jungle is what Borrell calls it in German. And the jungle said, okay, to us, it's the jungle. But I think that President Netanyahu, in his speech to Congress yesterday, said it in one sentence what the whole structure is. He said, today's fight is between civilization and barbarism. He was emulating what Rosa Luxemburg said. Of course, he got it. He didn't know which side. The question is, which side of the barbarian and which side is civilization? He didn't have the same idea that Rosa Luxemburg said, but that juxtaposition is what's really important.
Something quite fascinating I think we have, everybody has today, this idea that civilization is moving inexorably forward just because we see the progress of physics or math or technology or medicine. And there's this illusion that in every field of academic endeavor, we are moving forward in this way. But what you're telling me, it seems like there are these maybe special interest groups or just an unwillingness to look critically at the past. But in the case of economics, there were crucial understandings thousands of years ago that people are totally neglecting today, and that is hindering forward progress.
Well, here's the problem. It's not simply moving forward. I made my reputation in the 70s as a futurist. I was working with Herman Kahn for 4 years, with Alvin Toffler, with the Futures Institute, and I was known as, I thought, I don't want to call myself an economist anymore. I mean, an economist says, if you only get poor, that's the way to get a richer economy. I said, okay, I'll be a futurist. I don't want to be called an economist. And what I found in going, it was pretty easy for me to forecast what was going forward. I could forecast interest rates. I could forecast exchange rates. My specialty was balance of payments, and I could do that really well. And that's why I went around the world working for countries doing that. What was really difficult was looking at antiquity. All of a sudden, it was much more difficult than being a futurist. Understanding how different antiquity was, there was a transformation at work. That's what was so hard. It was so different that I could not imagine how different the late Stone Age was, the Bronze Age, classical antiquity. The whole system was so fundamentally different that you had a transformation of the social political system, not just moving forward, but self-transforming. And yet, although there was self-transforming, there was still this common denominator of the choice between a financial oligarchy emerging or a government strong enough, whether it's divine kingship or Greek democracy or the so-called Greek tyrants that canceled the debts and redistributed the land and led for the Greek takeoff to happen, or the modern socialist revolutions that had that. It's all a constant within this transformation, and you look at this really more of an evolution from one species or genus of an economic system to another economic system. You have to look at it systemically, and that's what economists don't do, or political theorists. They're tunnel vision, and there's a tendency to imagine that the past is just like today, and that, we're the heirs of Greece and Rome, so they must have been just like us. Well, if they are, then we're going to have the same fate that Rome had, the decline and fall of Rome. If that's you really think there's a similarity there, that's what it is. And the fact that Greece and Rome, Western civilization, took the Near Eastern takeoff out of context, without a ruler able to have the power to cancel the debts and prevent an oligarchy, the 1% in Rome, from taking over the land and monopolizing it and bringing on the Dark Age. And people think, the Greeks had democracy. But they didn't have democracy except for a very short move toward democracy in some electoral forms. Aristotle did a study of all the Greek constitutions, and he said they all call themselves democracies. They're really oligarchies. And that's he got it right. But the dynamics of how the oligarchies operated, the rhetoric they use, the words that they use have changed so fundamentally. You have to look at this transformative process. So it's not simply moving forward. It's a self-transformation unfolding that you really, if I'm forecasting the future, you really can't. I mean, what are we going to have now? Are the BRICS really going to have a global majority with socialist characteristics or with libertarian free market characteristics? What's going to happen to the West? Is it really going to just let itself be polarized and end up like the Roman Empire did? Or is Europe going to say, well, I guess we made a mistake. Let's get independent and join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization like I think Hungary would like to do, and maybe the Slovak Republic. I don't know. Or is Biden and the Democrats and the neocons going to be able to blow up? Say, if we don't go to war now with atomic war, every year we're going to lose power. And if we're going to have atomic war, let's do it now before we're even weaker next year and the year after. Let's blow up the world now. And Biden can say, well, I'm going to be, I'm going to lose it for Alzheimer's in another month. What the hell? I don't care. Let's press the button.
Earlier in the conversation, you referenced some countries. You said it was incumbent on them not only to raise the living standards of their citizens, but also to reduce or eliminate the external costs of living, such as education. And since student debt is such a hot topic today, though I think it was more of a hot topic a year or two ago, but is this one of these things that you think ought to be eliminated? And do you see a path for how that might happen going forward?
This is exactly the problem. Once you privatize public infrastructure, you vastly increase the cost of living. It was the conservatives, Benjamin Disraeli in England, that said public health is the whole thing. That's what it's all about. It was the conservatives that wanted that. In the United States, the first economics professor at the first business school, the Wharton School, was Simon Patton. And he said public infrastructure is a separate public capital, is a distinct factor of production. It's unlike labor. It's unlike land ownership, which is not production but a rentier claim. It's unlike industrial capital. It's not aimed at making an economic surplus. It's not aimed at making a profit. The role of public infrastructure is like the Erie Canal, the other American infrastructure. It's to lower the cost of doing business and living. So if we can have the government infrastructure providing basic needs, healthcare, education, communications, transportation, if we can have the post office, if we can have those water and sewer, if we can have those public functions provided freely or at subsidized rates, the government isn't in this infrastructure to make a profit. We're in to provide it as a basic economic right. He didn't call it human right, he called it economic cost, so that the employers don't have to pay their wage earners enough to pay for their own education, $50,000 a year today a semester, their own health care, 18% of GDP, their own transportation and communications that are monopolized. So that by privatizing all of these, all of a sudden they're run for profit and for capital gains and for management fees, and all of a sudden you have the advantage of socialist economies, and everybody called this public infrastructure socialism back then. Not only the Marxists, you had Christian socialists, you had Henry George libertarian socialists, you had all sorts of socialists. They all said the future of industrial capitalism is going to be private economies where you have an active public sector subsidizing industrial capitalism and its ability to compete with other countries by lowering the cost of living and doing services. The object of privatization is to make money by raising the cost of living. By raising the cost of doing business, that's how you make your money. So if you have an economy of private capital and privatization, of privatized healthcare, privatized education, of making its money by charging as much as you can, then how on earth can the Americans or Western Europeans that have gone neoliberal, how can they expect to compete with countries that are calling themselves socialist, but are really reinventing the wheel and doing exactly what the American industrial capitalists and the German industrial capitalists and the French industrial capitalists did in the 19th century.
Now, this time, on this note, Michael, I think I said at the beginning of our conversation, this is our third round on the show. It's been Really a pleasure to get to do this one in person, and hopefully that at some point there will be a fourth down the line in person. But thank you again. It's been great.
It's very good. I mean, as you see, I thought we'd go 3 times as long. I've hardly finished my margarita.